Welcome to a delicious journey through time, where we'll explore one of humanity's most beloved frozen treats, ice cream. Just saying those two words can bring a smile to almost anyone's face, conjuring memories of hot summer days, birthday parties, and simple moments of joy. But have you ever wondered how this frozen dessert came to be? How did ancient civilizations enjoy cold treats thousands of years before modern refrigeration? And how did ice cream evolve from a luxury reserved for emperors and kings into the ubiquitous treat we can grab at any corner store today? The story of ice cream is far more fascinating and complex than most people realize. It's a tale that spans continents and millennia, involving emperors and street vendors, scientific breakthroughs and happy accidents, cultural exchange and fierce competition. It's a story deeply intertwined with human innovation, trade routes, colonial expansion, and the development of modern technology. So grab yourself a cone or a bowl of your favorite flavor, get comfortable, and let's dive into the surprisingly epic history of ice cream. The ancient origins, frozen treats in the pre-refrigeration era. Our story begins not with ice cream as we know it today, but with humanity's ancient love affair with cold, sweet treats. Long before anyone had conceived of the modern ice cream cone, civilizations across the world were experimenting with ways to enjoy frozen or chilled desserts. The earliest records of frozen desserts date back to ancient China, around 200 BCE during the Han Dynasty. Chinese nobility enjoyed a dish made from milk, rice, and snow, mixed together and packed with ice to keep it cold. This wasn't quite ice cream in the modern sense, but it represented humanity's first attempts at creating frozen delicacies. The Chinese had discovered that mixing snow and ice with various ingredients could create something delightfully refreshing. But the Chinese went even further. Historical records suggest that as early as the Tang Dynasty, around 600 CE, the Chinese had developed more sophisticated frozen desserts. They created a mixture of milk products, flour, and camphor, which was then placed in metal tubes and immersed in ice pools. This early form of ice cream was a luxury item, enjoyed primarily by the wealthy and powerful. The process was labor-intensive and required access to ice, which in pre-refrigeration times meant you either lived in a cold climate or had the resources to store ice harvested during winter months. Meanwhile, in ancient Persia, around 400 BCE, a different frozen tradition was developing. The Persians created a dish called faluda, which consisted of thin vermicelli noodles mixed with rosewater and lime juice, then frozen. This dessert is still enjoyed in Iran and neighboring countries today, making it potentially one of the oldest continuously produced frozen desserts in the world. The Persians were masters of keeping things cold in their hot climate. They built elaborate ice houses called yakhchals, dome-shaped structures that could store ice throughout the year. These architectural marvels used evaporative cooling and careful insulation to preserve ice harvested from nearby mountains during winter. The ancient Romans also loved their cold treats, though their version was quite different from what we think of as ice cream. Roman Emperor Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 CE, was known for his love of a dessert made from snow and ice brought down from the mountains and mixed with fruit and honey. He employed runners who would dash to the mountains to collect snow and ice, which would then be flavored with various ingredients. This was an incredibly expensive luxury, something only the wealthiest Romans could afford. The logistics of getting snow and ice from the mountains to Rome before it melted required considerable resources and a fleet of dedicated runners. These ancient frozen treats shared common elements. They required ice or snow, they were sweetened with honey or fruit, and they were luxuries available only to the elite. What they lacked was the creamy, smooth texture we associate with modern ice cream. That development would take many more centuries and would require advances in both culinary techniques and our understanding of how to manipulate temperatures and textures. The story of ice cream takes a fascinating turn during the Middle Ages, particularly in the Arab world. During the Islamic Golden Age, which lasted roughly from the 8th to the 14th centuries, Arab and Persian scientists and scholars made tremendous advances in many fields, including food preparation and preservation. Arab traders and scholars had extensive contact with both China and India, and they encountered various frozen desserts during their travels. They took these ideas and refined them, creating shaba, a chilled drink made from fruit juices, water, and sugar, often mixed with snow or ice. The word sharbat derives from this Arabic word. The Arabs had access to sugar, which was being cultivated extensively in regions they controlled, and this gave their frozen treats a significant advantage over honey-sweetened European versions. More importantly, Arab scientists were conducting experiments with chemistry that would prove crucial to the development of ice cream. They discovered that adding salt to ice lowered its freezing point, causing the ice to melt while absorbing heat from its surroundings. This endothermic reaction meant that a mixture of salt and ice could become much colder than ice alone, cold enough to freeze other substances. This discovery was revolutionary. For the first time, it became possible to freeze liquids into solid form without relying solely on naturally occurring cold weather or snow from mountains. This knowledge spread slowly through the medieval world, carried by traders, scholars, and travelers along the Silk Road and other trade routes. It would eventually prove essential to the creation of ice cream as we know it. In medieval Europe, frozen and chilled desserts remained rare luxuries. Ice was expensive, available only to the wealthy who could afford to maintain ice houses where winter ice was stored in straw and sawdust. Royal courts occasionally featured iced desserts at grand banquets, but these were status symbols more than common treats. The Renaissance period, spanning roughly from the 14th to the 17th century, saw an explosion of cultural exchange, scientific discovery, and culinary innovation in Europe. It was during this period that something resembling modern ice cream began to take shape. One of the most enduring legends in ice cream history involves Marco Polo. According to popular myth, the Venetian explorer brought back recipes for frozen desserts from his travels to China in the late 13th century, and these recipes evolved into modern ice cream. This story has been repeated so many times that many people accept it as fact. However, historians have found no evidence that Marco Polo ever wrote about or brought back frozen dessert recipes. This appears to be a legend that grew over time, perhaps because it makes for such a good story. The real story of ice cream's arrival in Europe is more complex and less attributable to any single person. During the 16th century, the techniques for making frozen desserts gradually spread from the Arab world into southern Europe, particularly Italy. Sicilian cooks, who had extensive contact with Arab culture due to Sicily's history of Arab rule, were among the first Europeans to master the art of making frozen desserts. A crucial breakthrough came in 1533, when Catherine de' Medici of Florence married the future King Henry II of France. Catherine brought with her to the French court a retinue of Italian cooks, and these cooks knew how to make frozen desserts. At elaborate French court banquets, iced treats began to appear, causing a sensation among French nobility. These early frozen desserts were still quite different from modern ice cream. They were often more like flavored ices, or sorbets, made from fruit juices, sugar, and water, frozen using the salt and ice method learned from Arab sources. But the real revolution was about to come. In the 17th century, someone made the crucial innovation of adding cream and egg yolks to frozen desserts. The exact inventor is lost to history, though various sources credit different Italian or French cooks. What matters is the result: a frozen dessert that was rich, smooth, and creamy, much closer to what we think of as ice cream today. One name that appears prominently in ice cream history is Antonio Latini, an Italian chef who worked in Naples. In 1692, he published a recipe for a milk-based frozen dessert flavored with cinnamon, possibly one of the earliest printed ice cream recipes. Around the same time, French chefs were experimenting with frozen creams flavored with vanilla, chocolate, and other exotic flavors. By the late 17th century, ice cream had become fashionable in the courts of Europe. King Louis XIV of France was particularly fond of ice cream, and it was regularly served at Versailles. However, it remained an exclusive luxury. Making ice cream required skill, expensive ingredients like cream and sugar, and most importantly, ice. Even wealthy families could only enjoy ice cream during the winter months, or if they had invested in expensive ice houses. During the 18th century, ice cream remained largely a privilege of the wealthy, but the knowledge of how to make it began to spread more widely. In England, ice cream became popular among the aristocracy, and the first written English recipe appeared in a 1718 cookbook called Mrs. Mary Eales's Receipts. The recipe called for cream, sugar, and orange flower water, frozen using the salt and ice method. In France, a new profession emerged, the limonadier, vendors who sold various refreshing beverages and eventually frozen treats. In 1660, a Sicilian named Francesco Procopio dei Coltelli moved to Paris and opened a cafe called Café Procope, which became famous for its frozen desserts. The cafe is still operating today and claims to have served ice cream to Voltaire, Benjamin Franklin, and other luminaries. The 18th century also saw the first attempts at commercial ice cream production. In Paris, there were eventually hundreds of lemonadiers selling ice cream and frozen desserts. However, the ice cream business faced significant challenges. The lack of reliable refrigeration meant that ice cream could only be made when ice was available, and it had to be consumed quickly before it melted. Storage was nearly impossible. The recipes and techniques for making ice cream were often closely guarded secrets, passed down within families or professional guilds. Some ice cream makers claimed to have special methods that produced superior results, and they protected these methods jealously. This air of mystery only added to ice cream's appeal among the wealthy who could afford it. Ice cream crosses the Atlantic. Ice cream arrived in America during the colonial period, brought over by European immigrants who carried with them the knowledge and recipes of their homeland. The first written reference to ice cream in America dates to 1744, when a guest at a dinner party in Maryland described eating a fine ice cream served by the hostess. The American founding fathers were great enthusiasts of ice cream. George Washington spent approximately $200 on ice cream during the summer of 1790, a considerable sum at the time, suggesting he was entertaining guests with ice cream regularly. Washington's plantation, Mount Vernon, had an ice house where winter ice was stored, making it possible to produce ice cream throughout the summer months. Thomas Jefferson was another ice cream devotee. He actually wrote down a recipe for vanilla ice cream in the 1780s, learned from a French chef during his time as an ambassador to France. Jefferson's handwritten recipe, now preserved in the Library of Congress, calls for 2 bottles of cream, 6 egg yolks, sugar, and a vanilla bean. He served ice cream regularly at White House dinners when he became president, introducing many Americans to this exotic dessert. Dolly Madison, wife of President James Madison, became famous for serving ice cream at White House functions. She is credited with popularizing ice cream in America, making it a must-have at fashionable gatherings. Her most famous creation was strawberry ice cream, which she served at her husband's second inaugural ball in 1813. However, despite its popularity among the elite, ice cream remained out of reach for most Americans through the early 19th century. It required ice, expensive ingredients, and considerable labor to produce. That was about to change, thanks to a woman who would revolutionize ice cream production and make it accessible to ordinary Americans. The single most important invention in ice cream history came in 1843, when Nancy Johnson, a Philadelphia woman about whom very little is known, invented the hand-cranked ice cream freezer. Before Johnson's invention, making ice cream was a laborious process. The mixture had to be placed in a container surrounded by ice and salt, and the container had to be manually shaken and stirred periodically to prevent large ice crystals from forming. This took considerable time and effort and produced inconsistent results. Johnson's brilliant innovation was a design featuring a central container surrounded by ice and salt, with a hand crank attached to a paddle inside the container. As the crank was turned, the paddle stirred the mixture continuously while the container slowly rotated. This constant stirring prevented large ice crystals from forming and incorporated air into the mixture, creating the smooth, creamy texture we associate with good ice cream. The entire process took much less time than previous methods and produced superior results. Surprisingly, Johnson didn't profit much from her invention. She received a patent in 1843 and sold the rights for just $200 to a man named William Young, who manufactured and marketed the Johnson Patent Ice Cream Freezer. These hand-cranked freezers became immensely popular, and variations of Johnson's basic design are still used today in home ice cream making. The hand-crank freezer democratized ice cream. Suddenly, any family with access to ice cream and a hand-crank freezer could make ice cream at home. Church socials, community gatherings, and family celebrations began featuring ice cream made on-site, often with everyone taking turns cranking the freezer. Making ice cream became a social activity, bringing communities together. But there was still the problem of ice. In northern climates, ice could be harvested from frozen ponds and lakes during winter and stored in ice houses. But in southern states and during long hot summers, ice was expensive and sometimes unavailable. The ice cream industry needed 2 more innovations to truly take off: industrial ice production and reliable refrigeration. Before we can fully understand how ice cream became a mass-market product, we need to talk about the ice trade, one of the most remarkable and now largely forgotten industries of the 19th century. Frederick Tudor, a Boston businessman, pioneered the ice trade in the early 1800s. Tudor had the audacious idea of harvesting ice from New England ponds during winter and shipping it to warm climates, even to tropical locations like the Caribbean and India. Everyone thought he was crazy. Ice, they said, would simply melt before it could be sold. But Tudor perfected the techniques of insulation and rapid transport, and he proved the skeptics wrong. By the 1840s, the ice trade was booming. Ice houses were built in cities across America, storing ice harvested from northern lakes. Ships carried ice around the world. This readily available ice made ice cream production much more feasible. Ice cream parlors began opening in American cities, offering the frozen treat to anyone who could afford a few pennies. The first ice cream parlor in America is believed to have been opened in New York City in 1776, but it was during